With more than 16,000 of their citizens now reported dead at the hands of the Iranian regime, news continues to leak out from the protesters on the streets, with one saying, quote, "Please tell America and the world this isn't about politics. It's a fight between good and evil." And the footage coming out continues to shock, if that's even possible at this point. I mean, yesterday we had pictures of people with defibrillator pads on their chest, IV lines in their arms, and a bullet hole in their forehead. So they were either executed in the hospital by the Iranian regime or taken by security services from the hospital and then shot in the head. Let that sink in. Now, yesterday a new report came out from the Sunday Times saying they've received a new report from doctors on the ground saying that at least 16,500 protesters have died and more than 330,000 have been injured, most of them in 2 days of, quote, utter slaughter in the most brutal crackdown by the clerical regime in its 47-year existence. Now, I've seen some skepticism thrown at 330,000 injured number there. Of course, the one that stands out to me is 16,500. But when you look at the volume of people on the streets and you use the term injured, right, that could be anything from somebody falling and rolling or breaking an ankle to being hit with pellets that are being fired into the crowd to, wound, maim these protesters, but also mark them for the rest of their lives that they were taking part in these protests. 330,000 actually is within the realm of possibility here. They say the figures here were compiled by staff in 8 major Iranian hospitals and 16 emergency departments across the country. One person from Mashhad said, quote, "Tell the whole world that on Friday they sprayed everyone with gunfire. The IRGC forces were calmly trying to aim for people's heads." Another from Karam said, quote, "Snipers on rooftops were shooting people in the back of the head. We were walking when suddenly several people next to us would collapse to the ground covered in blood. When we tried to go towards them to carry the bodies away, they opened fire on us." They say another who managed to leave Rasht in Iran last week said, quote, "My brother works at Noor Clinic. He said that in just one night and only in Tehran, there were more than 800 cases of eye removal due to pellet gunshots to the eyes. My brother said that based on his conversations with other doctors in hospitals in other cities, the numbers are extremely high, possibly more than 8,000 people blinded by pellet gunfire across the country." And a note on this, so think of shotguns or riot control devices here that is costing people their vision. It's taking out eyes, but it's also marking them as these pellets embed in their bodies. They say, quote, "These are deliberately cautious minimum numbers. Many of the wounded do not go to the hospital, fearing being dragged out from their hospital beds by security forces, as we have already seen in some videos." They say one person who managed to get out of the country said, quote, "They've set up checkpoints everywhere. They search everyone's phones, go through their photo galleries, and physically inspect their bodies. If they find pellet wounds on them, they assume they were at the protests and immediately arrest them." And even in terms of the people that do make it to the hospital, we're getting reports that regime officials and security forces are going in there, taking people out that they believe were associated with these protests. In some case, we've seen evidence that they've been executed in the hospital. And we have a report here from a doctor saying that life-saving measures are being prevented by the regime. Quote, "Many have died because of shortage of blood. Although medical staff in several hospitals were donating blood themselves to keep patients alive, in some cases, security forces refused to allow blood transfusions." Quote, one surgeon in Tehran said, "We fight for hours to save lives, only to lose patients because they are not allowed to receive blood transfusions." So these reports at this point are coming in from doctors and hospitals and aid workers across the country, as well as the few Iranians that have been able to effectively or actually leave the country since the protests began. And it's not just the Times with these reports of the incredible brutality being handed out by the regime against their people. We have an update here from Amnesty International giving details as well, talking about the footage that they have so far verified themselves.
For the past week, we have been investigating the mass unlawful killings that the Iranian authorities have committed on an unprecedented scale since the 8th of January. The massacre of protesters has been committed while the Iranian authorities maintain an internet shutdown to hide their crimes. The internet blackout, which is now in its 7th day, has prevented protesters and eyewitnesses from communicating with the outside world. However, we have still managed to verify dozens of videos and access the harrowing accounts of medical workers, protesters, victims' relatives, and eyewitnesses. The information that we have gathered reveals that security forces have been relentlessly firing at protesters from streets and from elevated positions such as the rooftops of mosques, residential buildings, and police stations. We have seen horrific footage that shows protesters fleeing while the security forces continue to fire at them using assault rifles and shotguns. Hospitals are overwhelmed with the injured. We have seen distressing footage of bereaved relatives who search among body bags for their missing loved ones in overflowing morgues. Let us be clear, the Iranian authorities have resorted to mass unlawful killings in order to wipe out dissent and to silence protesters who have been demanding fundamental change and respect for their human rights and dignity. We urge member states of the UN to recognize that continuing systemic impunity for crimes under international law committed in past and current protests in Iran is driving the state policy of bloodshed. We urge member states to immediately convene special sessions at the UN Human Rights Council and the UN Security Council. We call on states to urge the Security Council to refer the Iran situation to the International Criminal Court. We also ask independent prosecutors around the world to initiate criminal investigations under the principle of universal jurisdiction. The spiral of bloodshed and impunity must end.
Now, I also want to play the personal accounts that we're getting from protesters on the ground. There have been a few cases where people will go on camera and blur their faces and give different names because they still have family members that are being hunted down inside of Iran. But we have one here, Alina Shirazi, the Daily Mail, presenting an account from one of the protesters inside of Iran, stressing this is not about politics. This is a fight between good and evil.
I also translated this message as well, if I could read this for you quickly, from an Iranian, from Farsi to English, and it is truly heartbreaking. Alina, have we been forgotten? Will all our deaths be for nothing? Our country is lined with the bodies of our loved ones, our neighbors, our friends, and strangers that we will never have the chance to know. The U.S. has said the killings have stopped. Well, this fear isn't living. This is dying. Whether we are alive or dead, it means nothing to us. Those of us still here are ghosts, wondering how this reality became our lives. Please tell America and the world, this isn't about politics. This is a fight between good and evil. We are all human. Please be our voice and be our humanity.
And we have started to see some responses from the Iranian regime. Ayatollah Khamenei gave a speech just a couple days ago where he's kind of holding the line that this is all the doing of the United States and continues to label the protesters as rioters, saboteurs, and terrorists. He said, quote, "The U.S. president sent a message to the seditionists saying he would support them and provide military support. In other words, the U.S. president himself was involved in the sedition. These are criminal acts. The U.S. president introduced the groups who committed acts of vandalism, arson, and murdered people as the Iranian nation. He uttered an appalling slander against the Iranian people. We find the U.S. president guilty for this slander. Agents of the U.S. and Zionist regime committed heinous crimes in this sedition. They vandalized 250 mosques and over 250 educational and scientific centers. They damaged the power grid, banks, and healthcare facilities. They murdered several thousand people. And we should note that is the first confirmation coming from official Iranian sources that thousands of people have now been killed. They say the U.S. has made extensive preparations to orchestrate this sedition. This sedition was a prelude to even bigger schemes. The Iranian nation defeated the United States. Yes, we extinguished the fire of sedition, but that isn't enough. The U.S. must be held accountable. Now, to this point, we've not seen any evidence of direct U.S. or Israeli participation in these riots. I would actually argue that the U.S. appears to have been caught a little flat-footed, and it seems like there's a lot of things we could have done to assist these protesters, as we share the same desired end state here of the removal of the Iranian regime is not just a net win for the people of Iran, but a win for the United States, as this is a regime that has the blood of many thousands of Americans on their hands and continues today to fund and train militia organizations across the Middle East that are directly in conflict with U.S. forces. Now, it sounded like last week we were about to see U.S. military strikes carried out against Iran. We no doubt do not have adequate resources in theater, and more on that in a second, to carry out a sustained campaign. And another question is, do we have the effective defensive resources there to be able to repel whatever sort of Iranian response comes? So, look, there's a very real argument that the time was not right and still is not right, and we'll get to the U.S. buildup in the region here in a second. But there's reporting that President Trump was about to approve strikes, and aircraft were in fact on their way when they were called off last minute because Steve Witkoff had gotten confirmation that the executions had stopped. The Jerusalem Post said, quote, a U.S. official and person close to the White House said that Vice President Vance supported strikes on Iran, with his reasoning being that Trump had drawn a red line in his warning Iran not to kill protesters and now had an obligation to enforce it. Look, something that this administration, understandably so, regularly points to when they want to say that past administrations were weak is the Obama red line in Syria. And I think that was a major mistake. We don't have to lay down red lines, but if we do, they have to be enforced, full stop. So maybe don't lay down the red line if we're not actually going to enforce it. And this is one that, we have J.D. Vance inside the administration saying, if you're going to draw that line, we have to follow up. They say Trump has also been shown videos by the CIA director of regime violence against the protesters, as well as presentations by the Defense Department and U.S. intelligence agencies laying out the military options available to the United States. Other Trump advisors, however, were against the strikes, including U.S. Special Envoy Steve Witkoff. Witkoff was reportedly in touch with the Iranian foreign minister via text and diffused the situation by informing Trump that the Iranian government had canceled the planned executions of 800 people. Following his intervention, Trump decided against striking Iran, telling reporters that he'd heard the killings would stop and that he greatly respected the fact that they had been canceled. So think about that for a minute. A text message from the Iranian government to Steve Witkoff says, no, we'll stop. And that pauses, maybe stops, but at the very least postpones airstrikes that could facilitate the fall of the Iranian regime. They are very vulnerable right now in a way that we've not seen in their 47-year history. Now, it's debatable whether Iran stopped at all, let alone even had plans to stop. We have Ali Saleh, the Tehran public prosecutor, following these statements from the president, saying, quote, Trump always talks a lot of nonsense and irrelevant stuff, and he's wrong too. Our actions are decisive, deterrent, and swift, and right now a large number of cases have resulted in the issuance of indictments that have been sent to the court. And we've seen senior religious figures inside of Iran call for a swift and brutal crackdown on these protesters, calling for the continued arrest and execution of anybody who took part. And so what we're seeing inside of Iran is the reclassification of these protesters. And it's been happening for a while now, where they were protesters and the Iranian government said we should talk to the protesters, but the terrorists we need to put down. And slowly over time, we've seen a reclassification of the people on the streets, the men, women, and children, from protesters to rioters, arsonists, seditionists, and terrorists. Those last categories, you can hear Iran right now saying, well, they're terrorists. We're going to put them down. Now, President Trump seems to be waffling a little bit here, and it's unclear if he does plan to take future action against Iran. In a statement to Politico, he said that it's time to look for new leadership in Iran. About Khamenei, he said, quote, the man is a sick person who needs to run his country properly and stop killing people. His country is the worst place to live in the entire world because of his poor leadership. And again, there are indications that the United States is still planning on carrying out some sort of military action here. The War Zone reported, quote, as the United States is reportedly moving at least one and perhaps more aircraft carrier strike groups to the Middle East ahead of a potential future strike on Iran, open source tracking is beginning to show some U.S. Air Force assets may be heading that way as well. They say the lack of forces in the region, both for effective offensive operations and especially defensive ones, likely impacted his decision to hold off. The war zone continued by saying there are also unconfirmed claims that the George H.W. Bush Carrier Group is headed to the region, which would add similar additional capabilities. The carrier left its home port on January 13th. The Navy declined to comment about ship movements, while CENTCOM has declined to talk about any movements of assets in the region. They say there are growing indications of aerial movements to the region. Open source reporting shows that more than a dozen cargo jets are now moving towards the Middle East. So look, we did have kind of appropriate assets in the region. It all depends on the scale of what we're actually going to do here, right? But, we did, up until a couple months ago, have a carrier strike group in the Middle East that was redeployed to the Caribbean to support counter-drug operations, then eventually the operation to capture Venezuelan President Nicolas Maduro. So, we can't be everywhere all at once. And there's a very real argument to be made here that if we want a sustained campaign, a long-term effective campaign, offensively and defensively against Iran, we do need to surge assets to the Middle East. That does take a little bit of time. Now, according to previous reports, the first aircraft carrier should be arriving in the Middle East sometime in the next 2 or 3 days. And then, of course, any aircraft that have been moved there likely are already in place. So we're getting to the point where enough should be in theater to carry out any sort of significant action against Iran should the president decide to take that path. Now, in terms of the fragility of the regime, something that we've not seen in large part, but that we're kind of waiting on, is regime officials and security forces stepping down or not willing to follow through on orders to shoot the protesters. And we haven't really seen that inside of Iran, but outside of Iran, there might be some cracks appearing. Iran International reported, quote, a senior Iranian diplomat based at the United Nations European headquarters in Geneva has left his post and applied for asylum in Switzerland. They say the senior official at Iran's permanent mission to the United Nations sought asylum with his family after leaving his workplace due to mounting political unrest in Iran. They said he decided not to return to Iran out of fear of potential repercussions linked to the ongoing political and social upheaval in the country, as well as concerns over the stability of the Islamic regime's governing structure. And it's possible that this is spreading and there's more of this happening. They quote diplomatic sources saying that growing international support for Iran protesters, including statements by European leaders and the European Parliament, has contributed to rising anxiety among Iranian diplomats stationed in Europe. They say several Iranian diplomats have in recent weeks privately contacted authorities in European countries to explore or submit asylum requests. So look, that's a positive sign. We're not getting a lot of that quite yet, and certainly haven't heard of anything like this happening inside of Iran at this point, but it's a step in the right direction. Now, big picture, it sounds like the protests might have died down a little bit. However, there are still videos and pictures coming out suggesting that even today, January 18th, there are still protests ongoing in portions of Iran. So they've not completely flamed out, but look, no doubt, this can only go on so long, especially when you're talking about a government that is willing and able to kill as many as, take the smallest number we've seen, right? 2,000 to 3,000, all the way up to the higher number of 20,000 plus. When you see that many of your fellow citizens being murdered in cold blood, unfortunately, violence works. And at some point, people are going to say it's not worth it. We don't stand a chance against an armed regime like this. And the protests will inevitably die down without some sort of, at this point, seemingly significant international pressure in some way, shape, or form. And right now, it doesn't look like we've really seen anything at all. But that's all we got for now. Thanks for watching, and I'll see y'all next time.